The Velkari Dominion had ruled the stars for 10,000 years, and they had never known defeat in battle against any species they had encountered across the vast darkness of space. High Admiral Tevonax stood on the command bridge of his flagship and watched the blue planet spin slowly on the main viewing screen, and he felt nothing but contempt for the small world called Earth. His compound eyes reflected the light of distant stars as he turned to address his officers, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. This world will fall within one rotation of their sun, and we will add another species to our collection of servants. The Velkari were magnificent creatures standing 3 meters tall with armored shells that could stop most projectile weapons and 4 arms that ended in claws, capable of tearing through metal, and their minds had been bred for war across 100 generations. They had conquered 17 species, and each conquest had been swift and total, because the Velkari understood war better than any other civilization in the known galaxy. Their tactical computers could predict enemy movements with 99% accuracy, and their soldiers felt no fear, and their commanders never hesitated, and their empire stretched across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. When their scout ships had first discovered Earth, the analysts had laughed at what they found. The humans were a fractured species, divided into hundreds of warring nations. And they had primitive technology barely capable of reaching their own moon, and they spent most of their energy fighting each other over invisible lines drawn on maps. The scout reports described soft creatures with no natural weapons and no armor, and no redundant organs, and a lifespan so short it seemed almost cruel. Tevonax had read the reports with amusement, and he had allocated a single battle group of 100 ships to pacify the entire planet, because anything more would have been wasteful. The conquest began as all Velkari conquests began with a show of overwhelming force. 100 warships appeared in Earth's orbit, and their weapons targeted every major military installation on the planet, and the message was simple and clear: surrender or die. The humans had surprised Tevonax then, and it was the first of many surprises to come. Instead of fighting or fleeing, the human governments had united within hours, and they had sent a message requesting negotiation, and Tevonax had agreed, because slaves were more valuable than corpses. A human shuttle docked with his flagship 3 days later, and Tevonax waited in the receiving hall with his honor guard, and he expected groveling and begging and desperate pleas for mercy. The human ambassador was a tall male with gray hair and a face that revealed nothing, and he walked into the hall with 5 others following behind him in chains. Tevonax examined the prisoners with curiosity, because he had not requested prisoners, and he did not understand why the humans would bring their own people in bondage. The 5 prisoners were strange, even by human standards. There was a female with short dark hair and eyes that seemed empty of everything except the cold amusement, and she was humming a tune that Tevonax did not recognize, and she had not stopped humming since she entered the hall. There was a large male with scars covering his arms, and he kept his head down and his lips moved constantly as if he was speaking to someone who was not there. There was another female smaller than the first, with quick nervous movements, and her eyes darted around the room, measuring everything and calculating something that only she understood. There was a young male with a face so calm it seemed almost peaceful, and he looked at the Velkari guards the way a scientist might look at insects under glass. And there was the youngest, a female barely past childhood with long dark hair hiding her face. And the other 4 prisoners kept their distance from her, and Tevonax noticed that even the guards seemed uncomfortable near her. "What is this?" Tevonax demanded, and his voice echoed through the hall. The ambassador bowed his head slightly, and his voice was carefully controlled when he spoke. "A gift, High Admiral, and a gesture of good faith from the people of Earth to the Velkari Dominion. You bring us prisoners as a gift." Tevonax clicked his mandibles in confusion. "Are these your leaders, and are you offering them as hostages?" "No, High Admiral, and these are not our leaders." The ambassador paused, and something flickered across his face that might have been relief, or might have been guilt. "These are our warriors." Tevonax looked at the 5 humans again, and he saw nothing impressive about them. And they were small and soft and fragile, and the female was still humming that irritating tune. "These are your warriors," he repeated, and he could not keep the mockery from his voice. "These soft creatures are what humanity sends to fight." The ambassador shook his head slowly, and his next words would haunt Tevonax for the rest of his very short life. "No, I, Admiral, and you misunderstand, and these are not warriors. Because we stopped sending warriors a long time ago, and warriors follow rules, and warriors have honor, and warriors can be predicted." He gestured at the 5 prisoners, and his hand trembled slightly. "These are something else entirely, and these are the ones we could not control, and these are the ones we kept locked away because they frightened us, and these are the ones who enjoyed the killing too much." Tevonax felt something cold move through his body, and he did not recognize the sensation. Because the Valkyrie had bred fear out of their species centuries ago. "Then what are they?" he asked. The ambassador met his eyes, and there was no deception in his gaze, and no hope either. "Problems, High Admiral, and we are giving you our problems. Because we do not want them anymore." The female with the empty eyes stopped humming, and she looked directly at Tevonax, and she smiled, and her smile was the most terrifying thing the High Admiral had ever seen. "Take them away," Tevonax ordered, and his voice was sharper than he intended. "Put them in the detention block, and we will decide what to do with them later." The guards moved forward, and the 5 humans went peacefully, and they did not resist, and they did not speak, and the young female began humming where the other had stopped. The ambassador watched them go, and then he turned back to Tevonax. "Hi, Admiral. May I offer you one piece of advice?" Tevonax nodded because he was still unsettled by the encounter, and he wanted information. "Do not underestimate them, and do not assume you understand them, and most importantly," the ambassador took a deep breath, "do not make them angry." Tevonax laughed, and the sound was harsh and dismissive. "They are 5 soft creatures in chains, and what could they possibly do against the might of the Valkyrie Dominion?" The ambassador did not answer, and he simply bowed and returned to his shuttle, and Tevonax watched him leave, and he felt a strange unease that he could not explain. On the detention level, the 5 humans sat in their cell, and Elena Vasquez had started humming again, and Tommy Redfern was talking to his dead sister, and Ji-Yeon Park was counting the seconds between guard patrols, and Ahmed Hassan was studying the lock mechanism, and Maria Santos sat in the corner with her hair covering her face, and she was smiling. The conquest of Earth had begun, and the Valkyrie believed they had already won. They were wrong. The detention block of the Valkyrie flagship was designed to hold the most dangerous prisoners in the galaxy, and the cells were made of reinforced alloys that could withstand plasma fire, and the doors were sealed with magnetic locks that required 3 separate authorization codes to open. The 5 humans sat quietly in their cell, and the guards watched them through security cameras, and they saw nothing threatening about the small soft creatures who had been delivered as gifts. Guard Captain Valinix reviewed the prisoner files that the humans had provided, and he did not understand most of what he read because the terminology was unfamiliar and the context was missing. Captain Elena Vasquez was listed as a former Special Operations Commander with 17 years of service and 3 courts-martial, and the notes mentioned something called excessive force and psychological instability. But Valinix did not know what those terms meant for humans. What the file did not explain was that Elena had burned 47 enemy combatants alive in the Amazon conflict because one of them had killed her dog, and she had not stopped smiling during the entire operation, and she had not stopped smiling during the tribunal, and she had never apologized because she did not believe she had done anything wrong. The dog had been her only friend after her family had died in the snow polo. bombing, and she had decided that anyone who hurt what she loved would suffer beyond anything. They could imagine Sergeant Major Thomas. Redfern had a kill count of 312 confirmed eliminations, and the file noted his exceptional marksmanship and his unwavering dedication to mission completion, and there was a small note about trauma-induced psychological fracture that Volinix ignored. What the file did not explain was that Tommy had watched his younger sister die in a terrorist attack when he was 17 years old, and something inside him had broken that day, and it had never healed, and he still talked to her every night because she was more real to him than anyone living. He had joined the military because they gave him permission to kill, and he had become very good at killing because it was the only thing that made the voices quiet, and he had never stopped because stopping meant remembering that Sarah was gone forever. Lieutenant Ji Yeon Park was listed as a demolitions expert with advanced degrees in chemistry and engineering, and there was a lengthy section about her incarceration at a military prison called Leavenworth. What the file did not explain was that Ji Yeon had built 17 explosive devices during her imprisonment, using only cleaning supplies and cafeteria materials. And she had done it not to escape, but simply to see if she could, and she had been disappointed each time. The guards had found her creations before she could test them. Her mind worked differently than other minds, and she saw the world as a puzzle, made of chemical reactions and structural weaknesses, and every room she entered was a problem to be solved, and every object was a potential weapon. Corporal Ahmed Hassan had the shortest file, and it listed only his service record and his combat evaluations and his psychological classification of antisocial personality disorder. What the file did not explain was that Ahmed had been diagnosed at age 9 after he had killed a neighbor's dog to see what dying looked like, and he had felt nothing, and he still felt nothing, and he viewed killing the way most people view breathing. The military had found him at 17, and they had recognized what he was, and they had trained him and used him and eventually feared him because Ahmad was not cruel, and he was not angry, and he simply did not care about human life, including his own. Private First Class Maria Santos had the strangest file because most of it was redacted with black bars covering the text, and there were no photographs and no psychological evaluations, and only a single note that said, "Approach with extreme caution." What the file did not explain was why the other 4 kept their distance from Maria, and why even hardened killers like Elena and Ahmed seemed uncomfortable in her presence, and no one knew Maria's story, and no one had ever asked because something about her made people afraid to know. She was 19 years old, and she smiled often, and she never raised her voice, and the guards at her previous prison had requested transfers rather than work her cell block. These were the 5 problems that humanity had sent to the Valkyrie. Guard Captain Valinix finished reviewing the files, and he felt satisfied that the prisoners posed no threat because they had no weapons and no armor, and no way to escape their cell. He ordered his guards to maintain standard protocols, and he returned to his quarters for rest. On the 3rd night, the guards opened the cell door to deliver food rations, and they found Elena sitting in the corner humming her endless tune, and she looked up at them with those empty eyes, and she smiled. "Where are the others?" the lead guard demanded. Elena tilted her head, and her smile widened. "They went for a walk." The guard stepped into the cell, and he did not see the shadow that dropped from the ceiling behind him, and he did not feel the hands that covered his mouth until it was too late. Tommy had been waiting above the doorframe for 6 hours, and he had not moved, and he had not breathed loudly, and he had learned patience in the killing fields of 3 continents. The second guard turned at the sound of his partner falling, and Jian was already behind him with a weapon she had made from a food tray and piece of sharpened bone. Ahmed emerged from the shadows of the corridor, and his hands were already red, and he did not speak, and he did not need to speak, because his work spoke for itself. Maria walked out of the cell last, and she stepped over the bodies without looking down, and she began to hum the same tune that Elena had been humming "Which way to the armory?" Elena asked. Tommy pointed down the corridor, and his lips moved silently as he talked to Sarah about what they were going to do. "And the engine room?" Gian asked. Ahmed pointed in the opposite direction, and his face was calm and empty. "Then we split up," Elena said, and her voice was soft and pleasant, as if she was discussing dinner plans. "Tommy and I will take the armory, and Gian will find the engines, and Ahmed will do what Ahmed does." She looked at Maria. "And you," Maria smiled, and it was a terrible smile that made even Elena look away. "I will find the Admiral." They moved through the ship like ghosts, and the Valkyrie had never encountered predators like this because the species they conquered fought with logic and strategy and predictable patterns. The humans did not fight like that. They fought like nightmares. Guard Captain Valenix received the first alarm 18 minutes after the cell door opened, and he did not understand what he was seeing on the security monitors. 15 of his guards were dead, and the humans were not running for escape shuttles, and they were not trying to hide, and they were moving deeper into the ship toward critical systems. He sent a combat team to intercept them, and the combat team stopped responding 4 minutes later. He sent a second team, and they found pieces of the first team arranged in patterns that seemed almost artistic. Valenix had fought 32 campaigns across a dozen worlds, and he had never felt fear before this night. He opened a channel to the bridge. "Hi, Admiral, and we have a situation." On the bridge, Tavanex listened to the report, and he still did not understand because the math did not work, and 5 soft creatures could not defeat trained Valkyrie warriors. But the bodies kept piling up, and the humans kept moving, and somewhere in the depths of the ship, Maria Santos was humming as she walked toward her destiny. The Valkyrie had conquered 17 species, and they had learned nothing about humans, except that they were small and weak and fragile. They were about to learn something new. The Valkyrie had protocols for every situation that could possibly occur during military operations. They had protocols for prisoner escapes that involved sealing sections and flooding them with gas. They had protocols for shipboard combat that involved overwhelming force and coordinated movements. They had protocols for dealing with hostile species that involved studying weaknesses and exploiting them systematically. They had no protocol for prey that hunted the hunters. High Admiral Tavanak stood on his bridge and watched his ship fall apart from the inside, and he could not understand how 5 soft creatures were doing this. The security feeds showed chaos spreading through every deck, and his soldiers were dying in ways that the Valkyrie had never seen before, and the humans were not escaping. They were destroying. Tommy and Elena had reached the armory, and they had killed everyone inside, and now they were distributing weapons to themselves and setting traps for anyone who came after them. Tommy moved through the corridors with a Valkyrie plasma rifle that was too large for human hands, and he made it work anyway, and he talked to Sarah as he walked. "Remember when we used to play hide and seek in the old warehouse?" he whispered. "You always found the best hiding spots, and I could never catch you." He turned a corner, and 3 Valkyrie soldiers opened fire, and Tommy dropped to the floor and rolled behind a support column, and he was smiling. "But I got better at finding people, Sarah, and I got much better." He killed all 3 in 4 seconds, and he kept walking. Elena was in the armory rigging explosives to the ammunition storage, and she was humming her tune, and her hands moved with practiced efficiency, and she had done this 100 times in 100 different places. A Valkyrie officer burst through the door with 6 soldiers, and Elena did not stop working. "Surrender, human," the officer commanded. "You are outnumbered and outmatched." Elena looked up, and her empty eyes met the officer's compound gaze. "I burned 47 people alive because they killed my dog," she said, and her voice was conversational and calm. "What do you think I'm going to do to you?" The officer hesitated for just a moment, and that moment was enough. Elena's hand moved, and something flew through the air in the flash. Grenade she had built from stolen components exploded in the officer's face, and then she was among them with a blade and the humming. Never stopped 3 decks below Jiyan. Park had reached the engine room and she stood before the massive reactor core, and her eyes were shining with something that might have been joy. The Valkyrie. Engineers stared at her in confusion because she was small and unarmed, and she was smiling like a child on her birthday. "Do you know what I see when I look at this?" Jiyan asked, and she gestured at the reactor. "I see a puzzle, and I love puzzles, and I especially love puzzles that can explode." She walked forward, and the engineers backed away. "I built my first bomb when I was 12 years old," she continued. "It was not very good, and it only destroyed half the garage, but I learned from my mistakes." She reached the main control console, and her fingers danced across the alien interface, and she did not know the language, but she understood the patterns because all machines followed rules and rules could be broken. "My second bomb destroyed the entire house, and my third bomb destroyed the house next door as well." She laughed softly. "By my 10th bomb, I could level a city block with materials from a grocery store." The chief engineer tried to stop her, and Jiyan killed him with a tool she had taken from the armory, and she went back to work. The prison guards thought they were clever. She said to no one in particular. "They took away my chemicals and my tools and my materials, and they thought that would stop me." She found the containment protocols, and she began to modify them. "But you cannot stop someone like me because I do not need special materials, and I only need to understand how things break, and everything breaks eventually." Ahmed Hassan moved through the ship like a shadow, and he left bodies in his wake. And he felt nothing at all. He had discovered something interesting about the Valkyrie, and they could not conceive of a threat that did not want to survive, and their entire security system was designed to contain creatures that wanted to live. Ahmed did not want to live, and he did not want to die, and he simply did not care either way, and this made him impossible to predict. He walked into a barracks full of sleeping soldiers, and he killed 17 of them before the others woke. And then he killed the rest while they scrambled for their weapons, and he did not hurry, and he did not rush, because there was no point. A young Valkyrie soldier tried to surrender, and Ahmed looked at him with eyes that held no mercy and no cruelty, and no emotion at all. "Please," the soldier begged. "I do not want to die." "That is unfortunate," Ahmed replied, and his voice was flat and empty. "Because I do not care what you want, Maria." Santos walked alone through the upper decks, and she did not hurry, and she did not hide, and the guards who saw her ran away. There was something wrong with Maria, and everyone could feel it, and no one could explain it, and the Valkyrie were no different. She passed the security checkpoint, and the guards pointed their weapons at her, and their hands were shaking. "Stop," the lead guard commanded. "Stop or we will fire." Maria stopped, and she looked at him, and she smiled. The guard felt something cold move through his body, and it was not fear exactly. And it was something deeper and older and more primal. He lowered his weapon. "Let her pass," he said to the others. "But Captain, let her pass." Maria walked through the checkpoint, and she began to hum, and the guards watched her go, and none of them could explain why they had let her pass, and none of them wanted to think about it. High Admiral Tavanax received reports from across his fleet, and the nightmare was spreading. The prison transport. Felix had gone dark, and rescue teams found only blood and silence. The escort cruiser Dominance reported intruders, but that was impossible because they were in deep space and no ships had docked. The supply vessel Eternal had exploded, and there were no survivors. How? Tevanax demanded. How are 5 creatures doing this? His tactical advisor had no answer because the simulations showed humans dying within minutes of engagement, and the simulations were never wrong. "Except they were wrong now, sir," a bridge officer called out, and his voice was shaking. "We have lost contact with engineering and the reactor. Containment is failing." Tevanax turned to the main display, and he saw the warnings flashing in Jiyan. Park had done her work well. "Evacuate the ship," he ordered. "All hands to escape pods." "Sir, there is something else." "What?" "There is a human on the bridge deck and she is coming this way, and the guards are not stopping her." Tevonax looked at the security feed, and he saw Maria Santos walking calmly toward his position, and he saw his elite guards stepping aside for her. And he saw something in her eyes that made him finally understand what humans were. They were not prey. They had never been prey. They were something far worse. The door to the bridge opened and Maria Santos stepped through, and she was still smiling, and the humming had stopped. "Hello, Admiral," she said, and her voice was soft and gentle. "I have been looking forward to meeting you." Tevonax reached for his sidearm, and his hand would not move, and he could not explain why Maria walked toward him, and the bridge crew watched, and no one moved to stop her, and the ship burned around them. "Humanity wanted me to deliver a message," Maria said. "Would you like to hear it?" Tevonax could not speak, and he could only nod. Maria leaned close, and her lips nearly touched where his ear would be if he had ears. "Run," she whispered. "Run, and do not stop running, and tell everyone you meet that Earth is not afraid of you." She stepped back, and she was still smiling. "Now," she said, "I'm going to give you 5 minutes to escape before I finish what my friend started, and I suggest you use that time wisely." Tevonax ran, and he was not ashamed because he understood now what the human ambassador had meant. These were not soldiers. These were monsters, and humanity had set them free. 3 weeks before the Valkyrie fleet arrived at Earth, a secret meeting took place in a bunker 2 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps. General Elizabeth Morrison stood before a holographic display showing the alien armada, and she looked at the assembled leaders of humanity's unified government, and she did not offer them hope. "We cannot win," she said simply. "Their technology is at least 500 years ahead of ours, and their fleet outnumbers our combined military forces by a factor of 100, and their soldiers are stronger and faster and better equipped than anything we can field." President Chun of the Asian Coalition leaned forward. "Then, what do you propose, General? And are you suggesting we surrender?" Morrison shook her head. "Surrender means slavery for our entire species, and I'm not proposing surrender." "Then what?" Morrison changed the display, and new images appeared, and they showed prison facilities scattered across the globe and the faces of the inmates inside. "Every nation in this room has secrets," Morrison said. "Every military has soldiers that were too effective and too dangerous and too broken to be released back into society, and we court-martial them, or we imprison them, or we bury their records and pretend they never existed." She highlighted one facility after another. Fort Leavenworth in the United States, holding 17 high-value military prisoners, and Krasnoyarsk Special Detention in Russia, holding 23 and Black Site 7 in Australia, holding 9. "What are you suggesting, General?" Morrison met each leader's eyes in turn. "I am suggesting that we stop pretending we are civilized, and I am suggesting that we use the weapons we have been afraid to acknowledge." The room erupted in protests, and Morrison waited for silence. "These individuals are not soldiers," she continued. "They do not follow orders, and they do not respect rules of engagement, and they cannot be controlled by any command structure we could create. Then how would they help us? Because they do not need to be controlled." Morrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "They only need to be pointed at the enemy and released." President Okonkwo of the African Federation stood. "You are talking about war crimes, General, and you are talking about unleashing psychopaths on an alien species." "I am talking about survival," Morrison replied. "The Valkyrie have conquered 17 species, and none of those species used unconventional tactics because they were too civilized and too predictable and too moral." She changed the display again. "Humanity is none of those things, and we have spent our entire existence fighting each other. And we have developed weapons and tactics that no other species would even imagine. And we have created soldiers that no other species would tolerate. And if they fail, then we are no worse off than we would be if we surrendered, and at least we will make the Valkyrie bleed before the end. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive, and Morrison was given authorization to proceed. She traveled to Fort Leavenworth first, and she stood before Elena Vasquez in her maximum security cell, and she explained the situation. "You will probably die," Morrison said. "The aliens will likely execute you the moment you cause trouble, and there will be no rescue and no extraction and no backup." Elena had been silent throughout the briefing, and now she tilted her head. "What are the rules of engagement?" Morrison paused, and she understood that this was the only question that mattered. "There are no rules, and there is no command structure, and you are not soldiers anymore, and you are not even human as far as official records are concerned." Elena smiled, and it was the same empty smile that would terrify High Admiral Tevonax and the others you mentioned. "And will they be coming too?" "Yes." "Good." Alana stood, and she stretched like a predator waking from sleep. I was getting bored in here anyway. Morrison visited each facility, and she made the same offer to each prisoner, and most of them accepted because prison was worse than death for people like them. Tommy Redfern agreed because Sarah told him it was the right thing to do. Ji-Yeon Park agreed because she wanted to see what alien technology could do when it exploded. Ahmed Hassan agreed because he did not care whether he lived or died, and causing destruction was more interesting than sitting in a cell. Maria Santos simply smiled and nodded, and Morrison felt a chill run down her spine. Despite herself, "Why are you really doing this?" Morrison asked Maria. "What do you want?" Maria's smile widened. "I want to see what is out there," she said. "I want to meet new species and learn new things, and kill them, perhaps." Maria's eyes were dark and bottomless. "Or perhaps I just want to watch." Morrison had recruited monsters, and she knew it, and she did it anyway, because humanity needed monsters. The five were transported to a secure facility for briefing, and they were given basic information about the Valkyrie, and they were fitted with translator devices, and they were told the plan. "You will be delivered to the Valkyrie as prisoners," Morrison explained. "They will think you are helpless, and they will underestimate you, and that will be their mistake." "And then?" Elena asked. "And then you do what you do best." Tommy laughed softly, and it was not a sane sound. "She thinks we are weapons," he said to Sarah. "She thinks she can point us and fire us like guns." "Let her think what she wants," Elena replied. "It does not matter what she thinks." Morrison watched them interact, and she realized she had made a terrible mistake and a brilliant move at the same time. These five could not be controlled, and they could not be directed, and they would cause chaos that Morrison could not predict. But that chaos would be pointed at the Valkyrie and not at humanity, and that was enough. On the day the Valkyrie fleet arrived, the five were loaded onto a shuttle with the human ambassador, and they were delivered as gifts to High Admiral Tevonax. Morrison watched the shuttle dock with the alien flagship, and she knew she would never see any of them again, and she felt relief and guilt in equal measure. "Do you think it will work?" President Chun asked. Morrison did not answer immediately because she was watching Elena wave at the camera from the shuttle's interior, and she was humming. "I think the Valkyrie have no idea what is about to happen to them." Morrison finally said, "I think they have never encountered anything like these five. And humanity," Morrison turned away from the display, "humanity has spent 10,000 years learning how to kill each other, and we have become very good at it, and the Valkyrie think that makes us weak because we fight among ourselves." She smiled, and it looked almost exactly like Elena's smile. "They do not understand that it makes us dangerous, and it means we have practiced war more than any species in the galaxy. And it means we have created warriors that are too broken and too deadly even for us to control. That is not reassuring, General. It is not meant to be reassuring." Morrison replied, "It is meant to be honest, and the honest truth is that we have unleashed something terrible on the Valkyrie, and we have no idea What will happen next? President Chun stared at her. You sound almost proud, Morrison thought about. That for a long moment, I am not proud, she said finally. I am terrified, and I am ashamed, and I am doing what needs to be done anyway. And that is what leadership looks like when there are no good options. In orbit around Earth, the 5 humans sat in their cell, and they waited, and they planned, and they smiled. The Volcari did not know it yet, but the war was already over. They just had not lost yet. The Valkyrie flagship exploded 17 minutes after High Admiral Tevanax reached his escape pod, and the blast was visible from Earth's surface. Ji-Yeon Park had overloaded the reactor containment, and she had done it with a smile on her face. And she had not tried to escape, because she wanted to watch her creation bloom. Tommy Redfern died on the flagship as well, and he was talking to Sarah when the end came, and he told her he would see her soon, and for the first time in 30 years. He sounded happy. The remaining 3 humans had commandeered an escape shuttle, and they disappeared into the chaos of the burning fleet, and the Valkyrie were too busy dying to notice. Elena Vasquez took control of an escort cruiser by killing its entire command staff, and she turned its weapons on the other ships, and she laughed as she fired. Ahmed Hassan somehow reached the prison transport Valix, and no one ever discovered how he got there, and he killed everyone aboard over the course of 6 hours, and he did it slowly because he was curious about Valkyrie anatomy. Maria Santos vanished. Reports surfaced for months afterward, and each report was stranger than the last day. Valkyrie colony ship was found drifting near the edge of explored space, and its crew had killed each other in a frenzy of violence, and the survivors spoke of a human female who whispered things that made them see the truth about themselves. A military outpost on a moon called Velthax destroyed itself with its own weapons, trying to kill a single intruder, and the intruder was never found, and the only evidence of her presence was a humming sound recorded on the security logs. A rim world called Dominance Prime abandoned spaceflight entirely after something walked out of the wilderness and visited every major city over the course of a single night, and the survivors refused to speak about what they had seen. The Valkyrie Dominion withdrew from human space within 3 months of the initial contact, and they did not negotiate, and they did not explain, and they simply left. They established a quarantine zone 50 light-years wide around Earth, and they marked it with automated warning beacons in every known language human space do not enter, do not engage, extreme hazard. The Galactic Council convened to discuss the human problem, and representatives from 17 species gathered to debate what should be done. The Valkyrie representative was a military commander named Valthex, who had survived the battle at Earth, and he still bore scars from his encounter with Ahmed Hassan. We must contain them, Valthex insisted, and his voice was thick with fear and hatred. We must quarantine their world and destroy any ship that leaves their system, and we must treat them as the plague they are. The Threnix ambassador rose to respond, and her species had been enslaved by the Valkyrie for 300 years, and she felt no sympathy for her former masters. The Valkyrie attacked Earth without provocation, she said calmly. The humans defended themselves with the weapons they had available, and I see no plague here, and I see only a species that refuses to be conquered. You did not see what they did, Velthex snarled. You did not see the bodies, and you did not see the joy in their eyes as they killed. I have seen what the Valkyrie did to my world, the Threnix replied. I have seen the camps and the executions and the systematic destruction of our culture. And I do not think you have standing to lecture anyone about cruelty. The debate continued for days, and no consensus emerged because the galaxy was divided. Some species wanted humanity destroyed before they could spread, and they remembered the stories of 5 humans dismantling an entire fleet, and they were afraid. Other species saw an opportunity, and they had suffered under the Valkyrie Dominion for centuries, and they thought perhaps humans might make useful allies. The Threnix ambassador sent a secret message to Earth, and she offered friendship and trade and mutual defense. General Morrison received the message, and she brought it to President Chun, and they debated what to do. "Can we trust them?" Chun asked. "No," Morrison replied. "But we cannot trust anyone, and at least the Threnics are not actively trying to kill us. What about the 5, and what about the ones who survived?" Morrison hesitated because this was a question she had been dreading. "Elena Vasquez is dead," she said. "She went down with the cruiser she captured, and she was fighting until the end. And the others? Ahmed Hassan is believed to be somewhere in Valkyrie territory, and reports suggest he is still killing, and he may never stop. And Maria Santos." Morrison looked away. "We do not know where Maria is, and we are not sure we want to know." Chun absorbed this information. "So we unleashed monsters on the galaxy, and now we have no idea what they are doing." "Yes. And you think this was the right choice?" Morrison thought about the burning fleet and the dead Valkyrie and the terrified aliens who had fled from human space, and she thought about the message from the Threnics and the other messages that had followed. "We are alive," she said finally. "Earth is free and humanity is not enslaved, and the galaxy knows we are not to be trifled with, and I think that counts as victory." "At what cost?" "At the cost of our innocence," Morrison replied. "At the cost of admitting what we really are." 2 years later, a transmission arrived from deep space, and it was addressed to General Morrison personally, and it came from a location that should have been impossible to reach. The message was brief. "We are still hunting, and we have made friends and we have made enemies, and we are doing what we were made to do, and do not send anyone to find us, because you would not like what you find." It was signed with a humming sound that Morrison recognized, and she deleted the message. Without showing it to anyone, Maria Santos was still out there, and she was still smiling, and she was still watching. On the bridge of a stolen Valkyrie cruiser, Elena's successor stood, and she was a new recruit from Earth named Sarah Chun, and she had been too dangerous for any military to keep, and she had volunteered for the program that Morrison had created. The program was called Release, and it took the broken ones and the dangerous ones, and the ones that humanity feared, and it pointed them at the stars. Sarah Chun looked at the display showing Valkyrie territory, and she smiled, and it was the same empty smile that Elena had worn. "Where to next?" asked her second-in-command, a former prisoner named Jackson, who had once killed 17 people in a single night. "The Valkyrie have a breeding facility 3 systems away," Sarah said. "They create their soldiers there, and they think it is hidden, and we are going to destroy it." "No," Sarah shook her head. "We are going to free the soldiers they have created, and we are going to show them a different way to live." Jackson looked confused. "I thought we were here to kill." "Killing is easy," Sarah replied. "Breaking empires is harder and more satisfying, and the Valkyrie will suffer far more if their own creations turn against them." She activated the ship's engines, and they jumped into hyperspace and the stars blurred around them. Far away on Earth, General Morrison received reports from across the galaxy, and she tracked chaos that humanity's children were spreading, and she felt pride and horror in equal measure. The galaxy had learned to fear humans, and that fear would keep Earth safe for generations, but Morrison wondered sometimes if they had created something that would outlast them all, and if the monsters they had unleashed would ever stop hunting. She suspected she knew the answer. In the darkness between stars, Maria Santos drifted, and she watched civilizations rise and fall, and she whispered secrets to those who would listen, and she smiled at the chaos she had helped create. She was not human anymore. If she ever had been, and she was something new and something terrible and something free. The galaxy belonged to those who were willing to take it, and humanity had proven they were willing to do whatever was necessary. The Valkyrie had come to Earth seeking slaves. They had found something far worse. They had found humanity, and humanity had found them back.